Welcome to harvest season in Iowa. As the temperatures dip and an organized frenzy descends upon our farm fields, we gather together for a global dialogue. A dialogue with the power to influence the future of hunger, nutrition, poverty, and health across the earth. Our planet and global food systems have endured disruptions and dislocation from war, climate change, and epidemiological catastrophes. The feeling of fragility is palpable, and it begs the question, how do we feed a fragile world, one faced with wicked short and long-term shocks? The theme of the 2022 Borlaug Dialogue acknowledges that vulnerability while focusing on ending hunger and reducing the impacts of global climate change. Whether you are with us in Des Moines or joining from around the world, we welcome you and look forward to a dialogue without an analog. This gathering will be something new. We are in need of new ideas, new innovations, new ways of scaling, and so much more. This dialogue will be challenging, uplifting, and above all, innovative. We want to come away from this event being able to point to new collaborations and paths forward to address global food security. Together, we will build solutions to address the most pressing challenges associated with increasing the quantity, quality, and availability of healthy food for all. This year, the World Food Prize Foundation is excited to bring programming designed for deeper exploration of the transformation of global food systems. And we're also here to celebrate Cynthia Rosenzweig and Mahalingam Govindaraj, our 2022 World Food Prize and Borlaug Field Award recipients. We are pleased you've joined us for the 2022 Norman E. Borlaug International Dialogue, and we look forward to the next 3 days.
Welcome to the 2022 International Borlaug Dialogue. I can't tell you what a joy it is to welcome all of you to Des Moines. We have so many here and 1,000 joining us online virtually. We are so pleased to have assembled leaders and experts from 63 countries and 6 continents, all with so much energy, their focused attention on the pressing problems of global food insecurity and the mounting global hunger crisis we face. The triple threat of COVID, climate, and conflict demands that we simultaneously address multiple challenges that are faced by our global food systems now and in the future. We face challenges at an unprecedented scale with the global pandemic, what we call a climate emergency in the last couple of years especially, and regional conflicts that have been going on for quite some time, and now the war in Ukraine. Challenges to our food supply, distribution, and therefore impact on hunger for our most vulnerable regions. COVID, climate, and conflict. You will hear this throughout our 3 days together. We have been talking about these triple threats, the 3 C's, since the laureates launched a laureate letter early this year, but also before that and throughout this entire year. This week, we will squarely face the complex web of challenges, emphasizing scalable solutions and emphasizing how we can sustainably increase the quality, quantity, and availability of food for all. This is the mission of the World Food Prize Foundation. This year, there's an emphasis on climate change, particularly because the 2022 World Food Prize will be awarded on Thursday night to an esteemed climatologist and agronomist, Dr. Cynthia Rosenzweig. Throughout the week, we will recognize the call for integrating both agricultural adaptation needs and mitigation strategies. We're going to limit planetary warming and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals both. We're going to explore in depth how climate and agriculture impact each other. This has been Cynthia's work. We'll highlight strategies and develop technology innovations developed to tackle the weaknesses that we know are in our global food systems in production, distribution, and access. And we'll acknowledge the profound vulnerability that we all face, particularly, though, for the poor, the most vulnerable, malnourished, and those facing unequal recovery from these triple threat shocks. Our deliberations will examine tough issues. We're going to look at the importance of both industrial production agriculture and regenerative agriculture. What is the role for each? We'll also look at issues such as how can agriculture continue to play its vital role in feeding the world, and also how should developed countries bear an appropriate burden for greenhouse gas emission reductions while continuing to encourage and uplift countries to develop and prosper. We'll look at these and many other complex issues. And what you'll notice in our deliberations is they're infused with hope and action. There's so much incredible work going on in the world, and it's our job to uplift and magnify, focus on what's going well as all the challenges we face. Stakeholders are striving to mobilize financing and technology and all kinds of innovative solutions in order to achieve the sustainable goal number 2, zero hunger by 2030. Some say it's impossible. It's not going to happen. You cannot reach zero hunger. We say you have to try. We have to try. We owe it to next generations. The solutions are there. They must be upscaled. So, where are we headed this week? We have what I hope you'll find is an incredible agenda laid out. There's breakout sessions like you experienced this morning. There's more tomorrow. Networking opportunities, exhibits are downstairs, and they're online for our online audience. The virtual audience that is included today is also able to participate throughout the week. So we're so thankful for that. And our virtual audience includes our Global Youth Institute. The GYI is all virtual this year, and 270 delegates. They held their roundtables yesterday. They're hailing from 19 countries, and while we miss having them so much with us here in person, we are committed to bringing them. We miss having them here in person. We're committed to bringing them back in person next year. Roundtable experts, some of you have served as that, so thank you very much. Continue your support for our young people. These are our future Norman Borlaugs. We thank you, all of your students that are participating online and everyone supporting them, and we look forward to welcoming all of you back next year. Each day we offer 1 or 2 keynote speeches. We have panel discussions and special roundtable discussions of larger groups. Administrator Samantha Power opens us up tomorrow, 9 a.m. from the U.S. Agency for International Development. Shamaran Abed is here. He's CEO of BROC, the largest Southern Hemisphere and Bangladesh-based international development organization, and he's going to highlight their impact over 50 years. The 2022 laureate hosts a special panel session tomorrow afternoon of NASA leadership. First time we're ever welcoming NASA into this global food security deliberation here at the World Food Prize. And tomorrow afternoon, late in the day, we'll all come back here after breakout sessions and present the Norman E. Borlaug Award for Field Research and Application to Dr. Mahalingam Govindaraj. He is of Harvest Plus, and it'll be wonderful to celebrate him. Thursday, we start with roundtable discussions again on health and nutrition and a just transition. This is a most pertinent and centered discussion for us going forward. We have a high-level panel, including Africa Food Prize winner and the president of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Roger Voorhees. We'll welcome online Dr. Uma Thurman, Uma Lele. I always say that, Uma Lele, who's an economist, renowned economist, but couldn't make it to be with us in person. Thursday, we have 6 ministers of agriculture from a variety of countries around the world, and Our own U.S. Department of Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack, will close us out. So, throughout the week, you'll have the opportunity to meet folks from Farming First. They'll be summarizing our discussions, available to talk with you, and they provide a daily recap. So thank you to Farming First. Online, we'll be seeking your questions, your comments throughout the entire event and posting them both on social media and on Excel events. So share your thoughts on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and using the hashtag FoodPrize2020. FoodPrize22. So, just a couple of special features about this year's dialogue. I hope that you'll see we have an increasingly diverse set of perspectives that we're offering. International perspectives, local to global. There's more gender balance in all of our programming, and this means more women in leadership positions brought to the stage. And we have young professionals and leaders on stage every day. Gender and youth. These two topics are so pressing, but you will not see two individual sessions focused on gender and youth. No, they are infused throughout all discussions because the issues of gender equality and youth engagement need to be in every project and activity that we're undertaking, all policies. So we're taking that approach. We'll be focusing on solutions and mobilizing to scale up because we know we must accelerate the pace of implementation of all of these tremendous activities going on. So you're all experiencing our new venue, our new look and feel. We hope that you find it comfortable and accessible, but let us know. We're looking for your feedback. We want to be of service to our global food security community. That's our job. So, a little bit about the food of this event. We are conducting the first International Borlaug Dialogue as a no food waste event. So, what you'll find is this is paramount that we address no food waste. We know that 1/3 of all food grown is wasted, and particularly in developing countries, of course, in the early stages, and in our own United States and developed countries, it's later in the supply chain. So our in-person events are really going to try to focus on this. We have special offerings of diverse and sustainable meals, such as the one that you just had. You'll see smaller portion sizes. We have plans for upscaling leftovers and for distributing any leftover food. And I have to say, I hope we planned well because we had no food waste from lunch. No, it's a tremendous effort, really, to try to do this. We all have to think about this. Planning and ordering food has to be done thoughtfully. Our vendors have to cooperate. They have to support the effort. And we all have to pay attention in the food that we consume. So be patient with our servers. If you don't have your favorite choice left throughout this week, be understanding and notice that we're using compostable materials. We're limiting plastic use. And there's recycling containers everywhere. So that's the plan for the week. You have in your bags, which I hope everybody has an opportunity to have, an agenda for the week. It guides you through, but there's also monitors everywhere. Everything's online, and there's even more opportunity for chat and resources online. So engage in both ways if you can, because our online audience is really anxious to hear from all of you. And now it's my tremendous joy to begin with a warm welcome for our first keynote address, Dr. Cary Fowler. Cary Fowler is the newly appointed Special Envoy for Global Food Security at the U.S. State Department. He has served as former Executive Director of Global Crop Diversity Trust and the international organization within FAO that's sponsored. He's also worked for years in the CGIAR, the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research. So after an auspicious career like this, it is our pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Cary Fowler. Welcome, Dr. Fowler.
Thank you. Thank you, Barbara. It's such an honor to be with all of you today in this place on this day. Years ago, I attended a lecture by Jack Harlan. Dr. Harlan was a geneticist. He was a plant explorer. He was an agricultural historian, worked at the University of Illinois most of his career. And the lecture was entitled Self-Perception and the Origins of Agriculture. I'll never forget it. His point was that how you believe agriculture began has a lot to do with who you are, with the perch you occupy in life. If you were an academic, you might be tempted to think, well, agriculture must have been invented or discovered by some particularly clever person about 12,000 years ago. If you were very religiously inclined, you would think, well, it was a gift from the gods. And most religions, in fact, have a story to explain the origins of agriculture. Likewise, today, I think how we understand the current global food crisis and certainly the solutions that we tout, these have to do with who we are and what perch we occupy. If your only tool is a hammer, you know how that ends. So I'm certainly as vulnerable to myopia as anyone. I realize that. I realize that the current crisis is, as Barbara mentioned, multi-causal. There's COVID, there's climate, there's conflict. But there are also a lot of other things, very high fuel prices, a fertilizer situation, export bans, low, by historical standpoints, grain stockpiles, et cetera, et cetera. But I cannot personally shake the belief that on the list of the top 10 most important challenges that we face in regards to food security, that climate is 1 through 5. When I became executive director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust back in 2005, I remember saying at my very first staff meeting that this was a climate change organization. I think they thought I was crazy at that time. But it was a climate change organization because climate changes everything. Last month was the 453rd consecutive month in which the global average temperature for that month exceeded the 20th century average. 453 consecutive months of above average temperatures. Of course, higher average temperatures are not the only thing that's happening with climate change. We're having more extremes, we're having longer periods of hot weather, and this is causing species to migrate, and so we're in the midst of seeing new and unique combinations of species in the field, in agricultural fields around the world. We're going to have some surprises. They're not all going to be good ones. Take a look at this histogram just briefly. The blue bars there represent a historical distribution of average growing season temperatures in Zambia. The legend is a little bit missing for the red bars, but the red bars are the projection for what will happen between 2040 and 2060. And what you'll notice, and I'll draw your attention to, is where they overlap. What this means is that in the future, the best growing seasons of the future will closely resemble the worst of the past. Let that sink in. If you go out in time a little bit further, you'll see how they actually almost completely diverge. This is the type of situation that we are going to be dealing with in the future. And I think that the assumption that we can somehow look into the rearview mirror for guidance about the future and that crop production is going to magically continue its historic upward trend. Why? Because, well, of course we need it to. This assumption has really outlived its usefulness. Should we worry about maize and wheat and rice and soy? Absolutely. But these are the crops that are attracting and have attracted historically the most research funding. So I'm worried about everything else as well, about the not so minor crops. These are what you might call orphan crops. They're orphan crops because they have a lot of potential, but we haven't been investing in them. Roots and tubers, fruits and vegetables, the minor millets, teff, on and on. The crops that are so vitally important for nutrition, if you think about nutrition as being more than calories. For many of these crops, there are very few plant breeders. For some crops like yams, for example, there are probably fewer than 10 plant breeders in the entire world. And a lot of crops, perhaps half of the crops that are grown today, have never had a single Mendelian-trained plant breeder working on them throughout agricultural history. So we justifiably, I think, will focus on how many people do yams feed, but increasingly, I think what we have to ask ourselves is, how many people do yams depend on? And in this case, it's not many. So how is it that crops evolve? Well, they're domesticated. Think about that word, domicile, domestic. They've entered the home. Their future is literally in our hands. Their adaptation is in our hands. They adapt by formal plant breeding and or by farmers making selections based on diversity, or they don't adapt at all. So we may want to learn a little bit from our own history in the United States. After all, when wheat came to the United States from the Near East, when soy came from Asia, when potatoes migrated northward from the Andes, when sorghum came from Africa, think about it. When all of these crops first came to the United States, they were experiencing climate change from their native habitats. How did they evolve? How was it that they came to be grown over such vast acreages in the United States? The answer lies in the selection that farmers made with the diversity that our own government provided them, particularly back in the 1800s. I will go backwards here for a second. So I think that aside from the top 5 crops that we have in the world today, basically all of our crops are orphan crops in the countries in which they're grown. Ideally, I think what we should be doing is to identify the crops that are or could be most important for nutrition. We should be assessing how climate change will affect them. And then with this foundation, we should be ramping up to help those crops, those domesticated crops, those crops in our hands, to cope with the climate change that's on our doorstep right now. We luckily have great resources in the gene banks around the world. We have perhaps 1.5 million to 2 million unique samples of crop diversity that wait to be explored and exploited for the challenge that lies ahead with climate change. Now, in closing, I want to take you back into history a little bit, and I want to mention 3 incredibly important things that happened in a single year in the 1800s, and that year is 1859. The first thing that happened was that in 1859, Edwin Drake drilled the first commercial oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. The second thing that happened at the hands of this man named John Tyndall in the UK. John Tyndall in the laboratory discovered and proved that CO2 traps heat. And thus, he, in a sense, discovered the greenhouse effect that was about to be created by the first slide that I showed you about the drilling of an oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And the third thing, of course, was the publication in 1859 of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species by natural selection. Darwin put together 4 basic steps or ingredients that you have to have for evolution, otherwise known as adaptation. He understood that there was inheritance and that there was diversity. The first chapter of Origin of Species is called Variation Under Domestication. It was about agricultural crops and domesticated species. If you have inheritance, which we do, if you have diversity, and if you have natural selection working on that diversity, then over time you have adaptation. Well, we still have inheritance, we do have diversity, we still have natural selection. What we don't have a lot of is time at the moment. And that's where we come in. The first 2 of these events from 1859 presaged the crisis of climate change and food security. The third points to a solution that we have yet fully to grasp. And that solution, at least in part, and here's where I acknowledge my own myopia, has to do with crop diversity. The very ending of Origin of Species by Darwin, in his last paragraph, in his last paragraph, he sums up the book and his feelings about what he has uncovered. That last paragraph is to me, it's like a Bach cantata. It is rich and it is exquisite. And I want to read that last paragraph to you in closing. Darwin says, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. And that while this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." My friends, I submit to you that this is what we need to keep alive if we hope to have food security in a climate-changing world. Thank you. Okay, thank you. Where do you want me?
We have a few more minutes, so we're going to continue the conversation just a bit. Thank you so much for your comments and perspective that you bring in global crop diversity, coming to this position now at the State Department. Just say a little bit about your position as Special Envoy to Global Food Security. It's a recent appointment, and what is on your agenda as you proceed these, especially in these first few months?
Okay. Well, if you were to read the job description that I finally found in the Global Food Security Strategy, I don't want you to look at it because you'll blame me for anything going wrong.
Okay, fair enough.
It's a humbling position. It is I guess the highest ranking position at the State Department dealing with global food security. So we have a lot to do with diplomacy issues, with coordination and collaboration with other departments and agencies. I think what I've wanted to bring to the position, however, is a more long-term view. There is obviously a great deal of attention that gets focused on the immediate humanitarian side of the food crisis, and I don't begrudge people working on that at all. But I think we have to realize that the humanitarian need is going to overwhelm us unless we put into place the kinds of programs that will help ramp up agricultural production so people, countries around the world can be more self-sufficient. So we're very interested at the State Department in my office in looking at initiatives that I think will pay off in a big way. The moonshot kind of initiatives that have a lot of cost benefit. And in that regard, I'll just mention that we will be trying to be a catalyst for what I mentioned from the podium about assessing crops' importance to nutrition, about their effect, their impact, the impact that climate change is having, and about trying to catalyze programs in the future that will help those crops adapt to climate change.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to hear that perspective on the work that's ahead of you, and I really appreciated in your comments both your advice, not necessarily to be able to look into the rearview mirror to find the answers, but also to consider 1859 and those seminal events that you mentioned. So let's talk just a little bit about the assessment charge that you're taking up, assessing the impact on crops of climate change. This is the business of Cynthia Rosenzweig and those at NASA and the GISS, the Goddard Institute, and particularly her AgMet project. Can you just say a little bit about the assessment not only of impact on nutrition of climate change, but some of the other aspects that you're hoping to focus on?
Yeah. Well, yes. Obviously, climate change is having a huge impact already on nutrition. It has deleterious impacts on the actual nutrition of our crops. It lowers the nutritional value of a lot of our crops. But looking forward, one of the things that's amazed me and frustrated me, frankly, is looking at projections of future food demand. You can go in the academic literature and you'll find many, many articles out there about what the food demand is going to be in 2050. Generally speaking, we need to produce 50 to 60% more food by 2050. And very often those same articles will give a projection of how much food we will produce. And that's where the reference to the rearview mirror comes in, because I think for the most part we are looking in the rearview mirror when we project future food production. And you can see the projections being roughly in the realm of 50% more by 2050. If you want to scare yourself, though, look at the footnotes. And the footnotes will say, well, this projection doesn't take into consideration climate change, conflict, food and price inflation, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, all the things that we're having today. If you, in turn, go to some of the climate people and look at what they're projecting for individual crops, well, you see that maize experts will tell you that 1 degree centigrade increase in climate will increase pest and disease damage by 10 to 20%. And in some areas of Africa, you can get the projection that, well, by 2050, with the climate change that they're looking at there, we won't be producing 50% more food, we'll be producing 10% less, and that's a big variance. So I think that one of the, perhaps one of the things that we can do at the State Department, we're not an implementing agency, we don't have these types of on the ground programs, is to sound the alarm and to say that let's be careful, let's not make assumptions about future food production. Let's look at what the needs are going to be in the future, and let's plan backwards from that. Mm-hmm. And let's put the programs and the investments in place that we really need to ensure that we can produce the food to feed everyone. Mm.
Tremendous perspective, really, to offer. Can you say a little bit more about the orphan crops, about the crops that have been considered minor crops, and yet we know we need to emphasize that diversity in production going forward? How do you see it?
Well, I think there are actually two categories, at least in my mind, of orphan crops. And the first category are of really important crops that we don't think of as being orphans, but they are. So that would be anything other than the top 4 or 5 crops. Crops that are receiving some investment and are very popular and well-known crops. Sorghum would be one. Frankly speaking, potatoes and sweet potatoes and a lot of those types of crops, and virtually all the vegetables would be in that category. Simply not receiving the amount of investment that they deserve if you're considering food security as being, as nutrition as being central to food security. Mm-hmm. The second category that worries me even more would be crops that we take totally for granted. This would be African leafy greens, for example, crops that are part of the household gardens in developing countries for which there are no plant breeders at all. And here again, we have to be careful about the assumptions we're making. Are we assuming that those crops magically are going to be adapted to climates that have never before existed in the history of agriculture, simply because we want them to and need them to? That to me is a dangerous assumption. So we do need to be devoting some attention to those crops as well, because they're disproportionately, I think, important, particularly to women, to children, because of the supply of micronutrients, and very often grown in household gardens.
Well, thank you so much. I know everyone appreciates hearing not only your in-depth scientific experience that you bring, but that broad policy and diplomatic role that you'll have in your position. We're coming up to COP27. Tell us a little bit about the United States and not an official position, but really, what are you expecting coming up next month?
Well, I think COP27 offers all of us an enormous opportunity to look at the question of crop adaptation, agricultural systems adaptation. I don't think it's any secret that agriculture hasn't been, let's say, given its due at many of the previous COPs, but now here we are. And I think we really have to take advantage of this because frankly, if our agricultural systems don't adapt to climate change, if our crops don't adapt to climate change, our crops being on the front lines, if they don't adapt to climate change, then neither will we. And so all of our hopes and dreams, if you're an environmentalist or whatever, will really go down the tubes if we don't have a successful agricultural system. At the end of the day, we all know that people will do what they need to do to try to feed themselves and their families. And there are many studies out there that will tell you that low productivity agricultural systems lead to environmental degradation. It was only the middle of the 1980s when we saw quite a historic transformation. In the middle of the 1980s was the first time in human history that we were producing more food, the incremental amounts that we were producing every year, came from intensification of agriculture rather than cutting down trees and expanding our croplands. Do we want to go back to what has been the most historically prominent way of increasing food production, which is to cut down more trees and expand cropland? Or are we satisfied with the route that we're on now, which is to make better use of the resources that we already have? And I think that's a message that needs to get out at COP27.
Food productivity over just flat food production.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of these perspectives. I want to connect part of what you're talking about with regard to adaptation and the mitigation opportunities within agriculture to the work that Cynthia Rosenzweig is doing and the sessions that we'll have tomorrow to really explore the assessment potential of the models that are being used worldwide already. I want to thank you for rooting us in history in this conversation. I know you've laid out some themes that we'll draw on throughout the discussion. So thank you so much for your time today and for being with us. And you're here with us throughout the week, I think.
I am.
I appreciate that.
Thanks, Barbara.